A watch ticks in reverse, and a man vanishes without a trace. Welcome to Grey Whisper. I am your host, Silas Drex. Drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? I love seeing this community come alive with every mystery shared. Let's begin. It was in the last days of October when London wore its gloom like a funeral coat. The fog that rolled in from the Thames clung to Baker Street, curling around lampposts and muffling the sound of carriage wheels until it seemed the entire city had been swallowed in a cold, woolen hush. Sherlock Holmes was at his violin, coaxing a dissonant series of notes that sounded to me less like music than a man trying to communicate with spirits. I was seated in my chair, leafing absently through the Times, when a sudden knock, sharp and urgent, broke through the melancholy symphony. "Enter," Holmes called, without rising. Mrs. Hudson showed in a young man of perhaps 25, his dark coat soaked at the shoulders and his pale face drawn tight with anxiety. He clutched a parcel wrapped in oilcloth, which he held against his chest as if it were a wounded bird. I'm sorry to intrude, Mr. Holmes," he stammered. "But I was told you are the only man in London who could make sense of this." "You were misinformed," Holmes replied, setting down his bow. "I am the only man in Europe. Sit. Speak." I tried not to roll my eyes at the usual performance. The young man sat stiffly and placed the parcel on Holmes's desk. "My name is Thomas Edgebury. I work for Grimwell and Blatchley, chronometric specialists in Clerkenwell. This morning a man was found dead in our shop, locked from the inside. We don't know who he is." "Police involved?" Holmes asked, opening the parcel with surgical precision. "Yes, Inspector Rivington, but he said it was suicide. I don't believe it." Inside the cloth was a fine silver pocket watch, open-faced and ornately etched. Holmes lifted it with gloved fingers, holding it close to the lamp. "I know what you're thinking," Edgebury went on. "It looks ordinary, but it doesn't tick forward." At this, Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Come again?" Edgebury leaned forward. "It ticks backward, Mr. Holmes, not by some mechanical fault or spring reversal. It counts time, in reverse. Seconds, minutes, from a precise moment. 9 hours, 43 minutes and 18 seconds, counting downward, as if time itself were being undone." Holmes turned the watch in his hands. "And this was found with the body?" "Yes, clasped in his right hand. We thought it was some malfunction, but, Mr. Holmes, the man had no identification, no name. He wasn't on the appointment register. No one saw him enter, and the rear door was bolted from within. But the strangest part," he swallowed, "he had your card in his breast pocket." I glanced at Holmes, but he did not react. "My card?" he repeated, expression unreadable. "Yes. Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective, 221B Baker Street. In ink, with your hand." I checked. And the strangest thing of all is, the card was dated 3 days from now. For a moment, even the violin's lingering hum seemed to dissipate into the fog. Holmes rose and crossed to the window. He stood there, silent, the watch ticking backward in his hand. "Watson," he said quietly, "pack a bag. We're going to Clerkenwell." The hansom cab rattled through the morning mist, the bells of St. James Clerkenwell muffled by the smothering fog that blanketed the city like morning crepe. Holmes had remained largely silent throughout the ride, his long frame folded unnaturally against the cab's narrow confines, the strange backward-ticking watch resting in his gloved palm like a trapped puzzle. I had seen that look before. Eyebrows faintly lifted, lips pursed in a line of thought so taut I feared it might snap and lash out at the next passer-by who coughed too loud. It was a short journey, but every clop of the horse's hooves felt suspended in time, as if we too were being counted backward. "Did you note the precise time on the watch when it was opened?" Holmes finally asked, not looking at me. "Yes, 9 hours, 43 minutes and 18 seconds, I replied. Why? You think it's counting toward something? He nodded faintly. Not toward. There's a difference. One implies anticipation, the other, termination. We arrived at Grimwell and Blatchley's shop on Hatton Garden, a 2-story establishment tucked between a jeweler and a tobacconist, its wooden sign just barely visible through the soot and fog. A constable stood outside, stamping his feet in the cold, and upon recognizing Holmes, tipped his helmet with brisk respect. "Inspector Rivington is still inside, sir. Upstairs." The air inside the shop was sharp with the smell of brass polish and lubricating oil. Hundreds of clocks, from ornate mantelpieces to stern regulator models, ticked in staggered rhythm like a chorus of mechanical lungs. I felt immediately as though I had stepped into a place where time was not measured but contained, trapped in cases of glass and walnut, and steadily grinding its way toward doom. We climbed a narrow staircase to a second-floor workroom where a short man in a heavy wool coat stood with his back to us, examining a narrow table under a skylight now smothered with fog. He turned as we entered. "Holmes," said Inspector Rivington, sounding neither pleased nor displeased. "Didn't expect you so soon. Edgebury's message only just reached you, I assume." "It reached me in time," Holmes replied evenly, "though whether that is a thing we are gaining or losing today remains to be seen." Rivington gestured toward the table. "Here's our mystery man." The body lay supine, arms at his sides, one still curved upward as if having clutched something. He was perhaps in his 50s, clean-shaven, well-fed, and expensively dressed in a brown velvet suit with a silver tie-pin in the shape of a stylized owl. His expression was peaceful, but not entirely still. There was something tense about the mouth, something unfinished in the set of the brow. "No signs of struggle," Rivington went on. "Door locked from the inside. Window closed. Nothing to suggest foul play except the card in his pocket, which I'm told you recognize." Holmes retrieved the card from the inspector's folder. He held it under the light with narrowed eyes. "Do you see the peculiarity, Watson?" he asked. I leaned in. The handwriting was unmistakably Holmes', the same firm, angular script I'd seen on dozens of hastily scratched notes left on our breakfast table. But the ink had run ever so slightly at the edges, not with age, but as if still slightly damp when pressed against cloth. "It was written recently," I murmured. Holmes nodded. "This ink formula. I switched to it only last week. Note the faint greenish halo around the main stroke. Curious. Curious. You wrote it, Holmes. I have no memory of ever meeting this man, Watson, and I most certainly have not given him a card dated 3 days hence." Rivington frowned. "Are you suggesting the man traveled through time?" "No," Holmes said flatly. "I'm suggesting that someone wants us to believe he did." He turned to the watch again, which Edgebury had placed in a padded tray on the workbench nearby. The ticking was faint, but unmistakably reversed, the second hand gliding backward with unnatural precision. "May I examine the mechanism?" Holmes asked Edgebury, who had rejoined us, standing nervously near the door. "Of course. We've tried opening it, but the case won't yield. The backplate seems fused." Holmes fetched a thin blade from the inspector's kit and sat beside the tray. For several minutes he worked with extraordinary delicacy, turning the watch in the light, occasionally pressing lightly on the crown or base. Then, with a sharp click, the back popped open. He let out a small breath and raised his eyebrows. "Well," he said, "someone has gone to considerable trouble." Inside the casing, where one would expect the delicate wheels and springs of a chronograph, was a custom mechanism, a strange amalgam of standard components and hand-machined parts Holmes clearly recognized, but did not entirely understand. He removed a thin brass panel and peered underneath. Then his expression changed subtly. He reached into the compartment and extracted a small folded scrap of paper. "A note?" I asked. "Of sorts." He unfolded it carefully. I leaned closer and saw just 3 words written in cramped cursive. "Don't wait, Sherlock." My stomach tightened. Rivington looked baffled. "What does that mean?" Holmes refolded the paper, slid it into his coat, and closed the watch again. "It means," he said calmly, "that this was no suicide, nor an accident. This was a message disguised as an impossibility. Someone meant this death to reach me." He turned abruptly to Edgebury. "Who discovered the body?" I did," Edgebury stammered. "Just after opening the shop. The front door was bolted from the inside. I had to call for the locksmith. And no sign of forced entry elsewhere." "None." Holmes nodded, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Then whoever brought him here, and make no mistake, he was brought, wanted us to believe the impossible. They chose a chronometer shop to stage this because they understood the symbolism. Time, Watson. This case is not about death. It is about time." We returned downstairs, the clock faces seeming to watch us as we moved. Holmes paused at the rear exit and examined the bolt. He stooped, then pointed silently at a fine smear of grease across the latch. I followed his gesture and saw a tiny flake of red paint embedded in it. "Old paint," I said. "Indeed. A match to the varnish used on the doors of those Royal Mail handcarts. Our visitor came by delivery." Holmes straightened and turned to Edgebury. "Tell me, did you receive any parcels or shipments this morning?" "Just one," Edgebury replied, looking startled. "From a private courier. It was an antique clock from Vienna, arrived an hour before I opened the shop." "Where is it now?" "In the storeroom." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Show us." We followed Edgebury to a cluttered room near the rear of the shop. Among the crates and straw stood a tall walnut case, its glass front still fogged from travel. Holmes approached it slowly. Then he turned to me and said, in a voice that made my neck prickle, "Watson, do you smell chloroform?" Before I could answer, he flung open the clock's door, and inside, lying slumped in a compartment where the pendulum ought to swing, was a second man, unconscious, barely breathing, still alive. Holmes looked back toward the ticking watch on the workbench, its countdown continuing without pause. "Someone," he murmured, "is playing a game." And the seconds were running out. The man in the clock was alive, but only just. Holmes crouched beside him, checking the pulse at his neck, while I dropped to my knees and began clearing away the stiff velvet padding that had cushioned the interior. He was a younger man than the first, perhaps in his early 30s, his clothing disheveled, lips tinged gray, and the faint chemical sting of chloroform still lingering around his collar. "Quick, Watson," Holmes said, eyes sharp but voice low. "Can you rouse him?" Breathing is shallow but regular. I checked his pupils, tested his responsiveness, then retrieved a small ampule of ammonia from my inner coat pocket. With a sharp crack, I waved it beneath his nose. The man twitched, coughed once, then let out a low groan. "Good," Holmes murmured. "That means he wasn't in here long." The man's eyes fluttered open, confused, glassy, and he tried to sit up before grimacing and slumping again. "You're safe," I told him gently. "You're among friends." He looked at us without recognition. "Where?" he croaked, then reached instinctively toward his vest, where a pocket watch chain had been clipped, but the watch was missing. Holmes saw it too and exchanged a glance with me. "You were brought here," Holmes said. "Do you remember anything? Your name, at least?" The man blinked. "Victor," he said after a pause. "Victor Massey. I was with someone, a man. We were walking through the docks. I don't remember coming here. Only a loud ticking. It was in my ears, like something was getting closer." Holmes stood, his expression unreadable. "Massey, of the Royal Chronometry Guild." "Yes," the man whispered. "How?" "I recognize the name," Holmes replied. You published a paper in the Horological Quarterly, a method of correcting minute variations in sidereal time calculations. Ingenious. Why would someone chloroform you and lock you in a clock, Mr. Massey? The man's face contorted. There was a demonstration. At the guild. I was told it had been cancelled, but when I arrived, He stopped. No, that's wrong. That was last night, or the night before. His hand trembled. I don't know what day it is. Holmes touched his shoulder. You will. Watson, have Inspector Rivington take him to Bart's under supervision. Keep him under guard, discreetly. I nodded and hurried to fetch the inspector, who was examining the first man's belongings upstairs. By the time we had returned and arranged for Massey to be sent off in a private carriage, Holmes had resumed his study of the antique clock, now stripped of its false compartment and laid bare on its side. Holmes pointed to the compartment's base. Look here, Watson. This false chamber was not an afterthought. See the joinery, precise, flush, hand-planed. It was constructed for the purpose of housing a man. Why go to such trouble? I asked. Surely there are easier ways to kidnap someone? Indeed, Holmes said softly. But not if the objective is not merely concealment, but placement, timing. This is theater, Watson. Our villain has staged not a murder, but a message. 2 men, one dead, one nearly so. A watch that ticks backward. A card bearing my name from a future date. These are not the tools of a common criminal. I looked again at the clock. Then what sort of man are we dealing with? One who understands symbolism. One who wants me to solve the mystery, but on his terms. Holmes glanced toward the watch still ticking on the workbench. 9 hours, 32 minutes, and 4 seconds remaining. Remaining until what? I asked. Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he returned to the corpse upstairs. I followed, now with Rivington in tow. Holmes began a methodical inspection of the man's pockets, collar, and soles. Places overlooked during earlier searches. From the man's left boot, Holmes extracted a scrap of stiff parchment folded once, tucked beneath the heel. He opened it and held it up to the gaslight. It was an engraving, an etching of a tower. Not a known London landmark, but a solitary, narrow spire set against a jagged skyline. Along the edge, in minute script, ran a single line of Latin, Tempus non revertitur, nisi insomnis. Holmes translated aloud. Time does not return, except in dreams. Rivington frowned. What is this? Some kind of secret society? Holmes ignored him, eyes tracing the line of the tower's silhouette. No architectural details. Stylized. Symbolic again. He tapped the base of the image. But this engraving was done on antique stock, 18th century at least, and poorly cut. Likely hand-pressed. Meaning? I prompted. Meaning someone wants us to chase shadows across time, to believe we are out of step with our own chronology. It is misdirection, Watson. Clever misdirection. Holmes handed the image to Rivington. Have it examined for printer's ink residue, and canvass a 10-block radius for anyone who's seen a figure matching Massey's description in the past 24 hours. Quietly. No press. Right, Rivington said, though I could see skepticism growing behind his eyes. Holmes turned back to me. We need to speak with someone who understands not timepieces, but illusions. An illusionist? I asked. No, Holmes replied. An architect, one who designs spaces where time seems to warp. I believe we have crossed paths with a designer of environments, not just a criminal, but a choreographer of experience. He reached for his coat and hat, snatched the watch from the tray, and tucked it carefully into a leather pouch. To Bloomsbury, Watson. We must pay a visit to Miss Eugenia Vallon. I blinked. The theatre set designer. The very one. She once created a mirror maze for the Royal Society of Occult Studies that caused 3 men to lose their way in under 30 seconds. If anyone understands how time can be felt rather than kept, it's her. We stepped out into the fog once more, the gas lamps burning like coins buried in ash. The carriage ride to Bloomsbury was quiet. Holmes watched the city pass, his fingers unconsciously tapping out the rhythm of the backward watch inside his pocket. Miss Vallon's flat sat on the top floor of an ivy-clad townhouse, its door painted deep violet, brass doorknob polished to a mirror shine. She answered before we knocked, as if she had been expecting us. She was a woman of indeterminate age, with a narrow, hawk-like face and grey eyes sharp enough to slice fabric. Her dress was peculiar, half Edwardian elegance, half theatrical madness, with sleeves cut at diagonals and adorned with tiny metal charms that clinked when she moved. "Mr. Holmes," she said smoothly. "I heard the ticking and knew you'd arrive." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Your hearing remains formidable." She stepped aside. "No, dear. The city is ticking backward. You simply took longer than I expected." We entered a room that felt more stage than sitting room, curtains layered over curtains, light filtered through colored glass, a gramophone playing some Viennese waltz at half speed. Holmes wasted no time. "Miss Vallon, have you ever heard of a clock designed to reverse the flow of perception?" She smiled faintly. A question only you would ask without sounding absurd. "Yes, not literal reversal. No such machine exists. But many have attempted the illusion. Mirrored oscillators, hidden escapements, reverse-geared regulators. They were popular among the symbolists. An artist named Gaspard Fenroque once claimed to build one that ran backward through a single night. He was found dead before morning. Heart stopped. Holmes leaned forward. "Do you know of anyone attempting such designs now?" Vallon's eyes narrowed. "Not openly. But there were murmurs. A group calling themselves the Somniaturae, the Dreamers. They believed time was a cage, one they could dissolve through symbols, ritual, architecture. Do you know where I might find one of them?" She hesitated. Then she crossed to a cluttered writing desk and retrieved a calling card, hand-pressed, ink slightly smudged. She handed it to Holmes. "He comes and goes. A recluse. Lives near Blackfriars. Calls himself Bell-ringer. Just that. Bell-ringer." Holmes studied the card. It bore no address. Only a line of numbers, 4318-3206-1201. The same structure as the countdown on the backward watch. He slipped it into his coat. "Thank you, Miss Vallon." She watched us at the door, eyes unreadable. "Be wary of him. He plays with time the way others play with fire." As we stepped back into the fading light, Holmes's voice was quiet. "The man in the shop is not our victim, Watson. He is our messenger." And someone was still keeping time. The fog had begun to lift by the time we descended from Miss Vallon's strange quarters, yet the air clung damp and close, as though the city itself were listening. Holmes stepped into the street with purposeful speed, his gloved fingers wrapped tightly around the leather pouch containing the backward-ticking watch. I followed, glancing once over my shoulder at the violet door, now shut behind us like a theatre curtain falling on a scene not yet fully understood. "We must find Bell-ringer before the hour turns," Holmes said, not slowing. "The numbers on his card, those aren't times, Watson. They're coordinates. A system of reference I've seen once before, in the field journals of the Royal Observatory. Longitude, latitude, elevation." We hailed a cab, and Holmes gave the driver the old water-pumping station near Blackfriars Bridge as our destination. The driver grunted in reply and snapped the reins. As the city passed outside in soft grey hues, Holmes unfolded the card again. 4318, he murmured. 34 degrees, 18 minutes north would place us. But no, the context is local. These aren't global coordinates. They're markers, possibly even adapted from railway telegraph codes. You believe this bell-ringer meant for you to follow them. I believe he knew I would, and that he relies on that knowledge to orchestrate his next move. You recall what Vallon said. He plays with time like others play with fire. That implies not recklessness, but precision. And the dead man in the clock shop? He was part of this scheme? Undoubtedly, Holmes said. Though whether he volunteered for the role or not, we've yet to determine. But he bore no signs of restraint, no bruising at the wrists or ankles. No broken skin save a single needle mark behind the left ear. I blinked. You didn't mention that before. Because it only occurred to me as we left Vallon's rooms. The delivery cart grease, the false clock, the staging, he was likely sedated in transport, not chloroform, something more controlled. He wasn't murdered there, Watson. He died there, but under design, not violence. The cab stopped with a lurch. We stepped out into a district where the warehouses slumped like tired beasts, their brick faces scarred with soot and neglect. A bell clanged from somewhere deeper within the alleys, a workman's signal perhaps, but it echoed with such a hollow ring that I found myself glancing upwards, half expecting to see no bell at all. Holmes motioned for silence. We walked slowly now, boots echoing on the wet cobbles, the smell of rust and river salt rising from every drain. Then, down a narrow passage flanked by broken fencing, we found it. A long-abandoned pumping station, its great chimney blackened with decades of soot, and its doors held closed by a chain that had recently been disturbed. Holmes knelt and examined the lock. "Filed and reset," he said. "Someone enters here often, but wants it to look deserted." He picked the lock in seconds. The chain rattled to the ground like a whisper breaking. Inside the station was cavernous and dim. Metal pipes hung from the ceiling like sleeping serpents, and old iron machinery stood cold and silent in the shadows. But on the far wall, just visible in the low light through a broken pane, was a strange marking, a chalk circle, drawn large across the brick, and within it an hourglass turned upside down. Beneath it, in that same cramped cursive as the note in the watch, were 3 words. "Count back from now." We stepped further in. Something clicked underfoot. Holmes froze. I saw it too, half buried beneath a grate, a line of small copper tubes wired to what looked like a clock's escapement, but modified into a timing mechanism I did not recognize. "Do not move," Holmes said calmly. "You've stepped into the first of Bellringer's plays. It's a trap, not for us, but for whoever comes second." He slowly stepped away and circled the perimeter. His eyes scanned the pipes, the walls, the floor, until he stopped beside a rusted workbench, now scattered with fragments of disassembled timepieces. On the wall above it, pinned in a tight grid, were pages, sketches, diagrams, notes in several hands. Holmes began reading aloud. "Phase drift, plus or minus, 4 seconds over 24 hours. Sleep cycles run counter to perception. The dreamer cannot know when he began to wake." He pulled down one page with a precise sketch of the same pocket watch now ticking in his pouch. "This is it. This is where it was built," he said, "and likely tested. See the annotations. Test subject A, tachycardia onset, dream interruption. These were not watchmakers. These were experimenters, psychonauts of time." I stared at the page. They were trying to control perception. Holmes turned to me. "Number not control. Reverse. Not physically, but perceptually. Imagine, Watson, if a man believes time is running backward, truly believes it, down to every tick of the second hand. How might he act? Could he be manipulated to behave as though events had already occurred? Could his mind be tricked into completing actions it cannot remember initiating? A sort of induced fugue, I murmured. Deliberate madness. Programmed. Holmes tapped the diagram. They needed the subject to arrive at the point of death believing it had already happened. "But why?" I asked. "To what end?" He turned slowly and pointed to a chalkboard beside the workbench. There, scrawled hastily and partially erased, was a line that made my blood run cold. The next will strike at 0. Holmes exhaled slowly. It's a countdown, Watson. Not just in the watch, but in the scheme. They've timed these events as one might time a theatrical cue. The dead man, Massey's entrapment, our arrival, Vallon's clue, all sequenced, all intentional. And when the watch reaches 0, I asked. We see the next move, Holmes replied. Or perhaps we fail to, and that failure becomes the final stroke. A faint clanging echoed from deep below the floor. We both turned. That's not a boiler, Holmes said grimly. That's a bell. We moved quickly, descending rusted iron steps to a lower chamber half submerged in dark water. In the center stood a bell, ancient, oxidized, and suspended not by rope, but by a vast clockwork contraption rigged with gears and counterweights. Above it, a platform held what appeared to be a steel box. From the box trailed a single length of brass pipe directly to the bell's heart. Holmes climbed the stairs to the platform, examined the mechanism, and shouted down, "This is the stroke, Watson. If the countdown completes, this releases, and whatever is in that box floods the bell chamber, a gas reservoir. See, the pressure gauge. This is not a warning bell. It is a trigger." I stared upward, chilled. "Someone intends for us to hear it," I called up. "But not until the precise second." Holmes nodded. "And someone else will die, just as the last one did, at a moment of their choosing." We climbed out, the weight of unseen time pressing on our shoulders. As we stepped into the grey afternoon once more, Holmes drew out the watch. 8 hours, 10 minutes, he said. "That's what we have." And then, Holmes looked up, eyes narrowed. Then the bell rings. We returned to Baker Street beneath a sky darkening with more than just the usual London soot. The fog had begun to rise again, thicker now, colder, and with it came a strange hush in the city's rhythm, as though the whole of London had begun holding its breath. Holmes said little during the journey, though his eyes never left the backward-ticking watch, which he held cradled in one hand like a time bomb whose detonator was silence. Back at the sitting room, Mrs. Hudson had lit the fire and brought in tea without a word, her glances to Holmes wary. He didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he spread the leather pouch, the watch, the card with the coordinates, and the folded parchment from the dead man's boot across the table like pieces of a puzzle he had grown to resent. The tension in the room felt sharp enough to shave steel. "Watson," he said, finally breaking the silence, "do you recall the first time we encountered a design meant not to deceive the senses, but to dislocate them?" "The Hall of Shadows," I said at once. "The case of the vanished stagehand at the Pavilion Theatre." He nodded. "Precisely. That illusion depended not upon hiding a man, but upon convincing him he was elsewhere. Bellringer is using the same principle, on us and on his victims." I poured us both tea, though I doubted Holmes would touch his. "You think this is all staged to disorient?" "Yes. Consider the facts. The dead man arrives in a locked room. The watch counts backward. The name Bellringer leads us to a literal bell tied to a gas mechanism. Even Vallon, with her flair for pageantry, was playing a role. This isn't a murder investigation. It's a performance." I set my cup down. "But what is its purpose?" "To force a specific reaction, Watson. Just as a dramatist sets his audience up for the final act. Every clue draws us forward. Every symbol suggests inevitability. And what awaits us when the clock strikes 0? A final trick, no doubt, but one meant to reveal something greater than a corpse." He rose suddenly and moved to his writing desk. From the drawer he pulled a thin portfolio of papers, our compiled files on the unidentified dead man, Victor Massey, and the transcripts from Inspector Rivington's brief interviews. Holmes read aloud from Rivington's summary. "Victor Massey reports confusion on waking, distorted sense of sequence and dreams involving water and bells. Repeated fixation on the phrase, 'He's already seen it.' He stopped and looked up. Watson. The dead man. The one found in Grimwell and Blatchley. What if he too was subjected to the same manipulation? What if he died believing he had already lived through the moment of death? Then his death becomes, what? A reenactment? An execution, Holmes said flatly. One designed not for vengeance, but for proof. Bellringer is testing something, and that test is not complete. At that moment, a soft knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a note. "This just arrived, sir." By hand, the boy who delivered it vanished before I could tip him. Holmes opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of parchment and a photograph. The note bore no greeting. Only 5 words, "You're walking backward." Holmes unfolded the photograph. It was grainy but clear enough. A shot taken from some hidden vantage, looking down onto the pumping station platform we had stood upon not hours ago. There we were. Holmes, myself, the bell behind us. But the chilling detail was this. Behind Holmes stood a third figure, cloaked, motionless, almost blending into the shadows. Holmes tapped the image. He was there, with us, watching. I stared at the figure. But we didn't hear a sound. "Of course not," Holmes murmured. "We were meant not to. That is Bellringer's art, to be present without presence. He choreographs from within the stage." He placed the photograph beside the parchment with the tower sketch and the Latin phrase. "Watson, it's time we stopped following his cues. If we continue on this path, we arrive only where he has placed the spotlight. We must exit the stage and re-enter from the wings." "You're suggesting we step outside the narrative?" "I'm suggesting we disrupt it." He turned abruptly, and the energy in the room shifted. Within moments, Holmes was at the mantel, sliding aside a row of tobacco jars to reveal a hidden compartment. From it, he removed a flat wooden case, which he opened to reveal a set of grease paint sticks, a false beard, and an assortment of prosthetic noses. "My dear doctor," he said with a half-smile, "you are once again about to become my audience." Within 30 minutes, Holmes had transformed. He was no longer the sharp-eyed consulting detective of Baker Street, but an aging itinerant preacher with stooped shoulders, false spectacles, and a mole on one cheek that looked unpleasantly real. His accent shifted into the quavering baritone of a country rector. "I shall make my way alone," he said. "If Bellringer believes I remain within his clockwork, he will not look beyond it. You, Watson, must do the one thing no performer expects: remain silent. Do not chase, do not follow, do not write. Wait. Wait for what?" "For the next strike," Holmes said, adjusting his coat. "And then move in the opposite direction." With that, he was gone, vanishing into the mist just as the watch ticked down to 7 hours, 11 minutes. I waited. The flat grew still again, the fire settling into low embers. Outside, the city seemed to hum with a tension I could not name. The clock on the mantel chimed 6, then 7. At 7:43 there was a scratching at the window pane. I rose and crossed the room, lifting the sash. A boy stood below in the alley, hand raised, a folded note in his fist. I descended and took it from him. No name. Just a phrase, in the same angular hand that had penned the first card, pendulum reversed. Silence falls. No signature. But I understood. It was Holmes. He had made contact with Bellringer, or Bellringer had found him first. I turned the note over. There, scrawled hastily, was a map of the South Bank, and an X marked beneath an arch near Hungerford Bridge. The next move was ours, and the seconds were still slipping away. The wind was colder by the Thames, and as I made my way along the embankment toward Hungerford Bridge, the chill seemed to coil at my collar, threading its fingers down my spine. The map Holmes had sent was hand-drawn but precise, with the X marked not on the bridge proper, but beneath it. somewhere in the network of arches and underpasses that ran beside the muddy shore, half lost in fog and the sloshing breath of the river. It was a part of London often forgotten, where old stone met rusted iron, and the city seemed to whisper to itself in guttural tones. I passed a beggar asleep beneath a crumbling arch, a fishmonger unloading crates with gloved hands, and a street musician playing a sorrowful melody on a cracked violin. None met my eye. Holmes had warned me not to follow directly, but this was a summons. Pendulum reversed. Silence falls. He was signaling a shift. The performance had turned, and the only way to disrupt the script bell ringer had written was to arrive where no one had yet looked, behind the curtain. I found the arch near the edge of the South Bank wharf, just where the river narrowed into darker waters. There, set discreetly behind a wrought iron fence and a weathered wooden door, was a small alcove of stone. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a tunnel descending into shadow. I hesitated only a moment, then stepped inside. The passage was low and narrow, the walls damp, with moss crawling like fingers along the brickwork. A gas lantern burned somewhere ahead, casting flickering shadows across the stone. I followed the light until the passage opened into a vaulted chamber, the ceiling held up by ancient arches blackened with soot. At its center stood Holmes, or rather, the man he had become. He wore the same disguise, old preacher's coat, white false beard, and spectacles. But his posture had changed. Straighter now, alert. He turned at the sound of my steps and lowered his hood. I saw relief flicker in his eyes. "You received the message," he said softly. "Yes. But what is this place?" Holmes gestured to the space around us. This was once a chapel, a mariner's refuge for prayers before journeying downriver, abandoned since the flood of 1846. But Bellringer has claimed it for something else. He led me toward the altar, where an old lectern had been repurposed. Upon it rested a single object, a pendulum suspended by a copper armature from the vaulted ceiling. But instead of swinging side to side, it was motionless, frozen in mid-arc, as though arrested mid-stroke by invisible hands. Holmes circled it carefully. Electromagnetic arrestor, ingeniously rigged. Not a physical impossibility, but a visual one. A device intended to make time appear still. "And the message?" I asked. "Pendulum reversed." "Symbolic," Holmes said. "He's shifting the illusion. Until now, we have been chasing time as it seemed to rewind. Now we enter the phase where time stops, the still moment before release, the eye of the performance." "Is Bellringer here?" I asked. Holmes stepped closer to the pendulum. He was. Just minutes ago, he left this. He handed me a page torn from a book. I recognized the edges. Similar stock to the parchment found in the dead man's boot. Written on it were the words, "When the bell tolls 0, one man vanishes, and another awakens." Holmes watched me read, then added, "The implication is clear. There is one more subject in this sequence, one more figure who will complete the pattern unless we can stop it." "Do you believe he means to kill again?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes said carefully, "that Bellringer believes death is incidental. What matters to him is transformation. This entire play is an experiment in the rearrangement of perception." He gestured to the pendulum. "Stopping time, reversing memory, collapsing future and past into the same event." I stared at the device. "But to what end?" "That," Holmes said, "is what I mean to find out, and we must find out before the countdown ends." From his coat he retrieved the backward watch and laid it gently beside the pendulum. Its ticking had grown louder in the quiet of the chamber, each reversed second a sharp, deliberate knock. He tapped the glass. 6 hours, 13 minutes, he said. "Time is still moving, but if Bellringer has structured this final act as he did the others, the 0 hour will bring not closure, but confusion, and in that confusion he will attempt the true sleight of hand. I stepped back and looked around. "Do we know who the next victim is?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice low and cold, "Yes, I believe we do." I stared at him. Holmes did not blink. "He's chosen me, Watson." I felt the ground shift. "You can't mean—" "I can, and I do. Every step of this has led here. The card in the dead man's pocket, the message inside the watch, the photograph taken from the shadows. The performer always ends his act with the audience's focus squarely on him. But why? You're not—" "I'm the constant," Holmes interrupted. "The fixed point. Bellringer is attempting to erase constants, to make time pliable by unseating its witnesses." A silence passed between us, broken only by the faint ticking from the watch. "Then we change the script," I said quietly. Holmes looked at me. "We take the last cue from him before he gives it," I went on. "We set our trap." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Go on." "Grimwell and Blatchley. The scene was dressed before we arrived. The pumping station, too. All spaces designed for impact. But this chapel, it's different. He led you here, not the authorities. He wants you alone." Holmes nodded slowly. "He wants me to believe I'm outside the system while keeping me inside it." "Exactly. But what if we make this space his final stage, one he cannot control?" Holmes paced once, then stopped abruptly. "You're proposing inversion, a mirror of the trick. If he believes I'll remain here awaiting the next cue, then let me stay instead," I said. "As Holmes, in disguise. Let him perform the final act on a man who knows he's being watched." Holmes's eyes narrowed, thoughtful. "He will attempt contact before the bell rings. He cannot resist the flourish, but he will not approach if he suspects alteration." "Then make no alteration," I said. "Let the watch tick. Let the pendulum hang. But let the audience change roles." Holmes's face changed then, not with fear nor excitement, but with grim respect. He stepped forward, removed the preacher's coat and beard, and placed them in my arms. "Don't improvise," he said. "Bellringer thrives on improvisation. Give him what he expects until the final breath. And watch the shadows." I nodded. Holmes turned once, his coat swirling behind him like the closing of a curtain. "I'll be where he cannot see," he said. "Go on, Watson." And I did. I pulled the preacher's coat tightly around me, fastened the worn buttons with hands that trembled only slightly, and stepped into Holmes' place beneath the vault of the stone chapel. The damp walls whispered, the moss glistened in the lantern light, and the pendulum, still locked in that unnatural arc, hung motionless above me. Beside it, the backward-ticking watch counted down in mechanical defiance of everything I understood. 5 hours, 42 minutes. Holmes had vanished like breath into fog, his final look to me one of measured confidence but not reassurance. This was a theater of shadows now, and I was alone beneath its lights. Every sound in that place seemed louder in solitude. The creak of shifting beams above, the faint drip of unseen water from some distant pipe, and my own breath as it echoed too distinctly in my ears. I rehearsed my movements with care. Holmes had instructed me to mirror his stillness, to not act, but react, and only when Bellringer made his move. If the man truly believed Holmes was beneath the chapel, awaiting the appointed hour, then he would come here to complete the illusion he had so carefully arranged. And when he did, I would be waiting. But it was a waiting without comfort. Time passed like smoke, and I could not tell if minutes or hours were slipping by. I paced the chamber slowly, always returning to the lectern, to the pendulum and the watch beside it. I read again the phrase Holmes had shown me. When the bell tolls 0, one man vanishes and another awakens. Was I to vanish? Was I to awaken? Or was Bellringer the one orchestrating both at once? At last, a sound. It came not from the passage behind me, but from the far wall where the shadows were deepest, a faint scrape of metal against stone. I turned slowly, every muscle taut beneath the weight of Holmes's disguise. A man stood there. He had emerged silently as if drawn from the wall itself. Tall, angular, draped in a dark coat that blended with the shadows, and wearing a black cap low over his brow. In his left hand, he held a small satchel. In his right, a silver object, a bell no larger than a teacup, polished to a mirror finish. His voice, when it came, was quiet and deliberate. "You stood in the wrong place, Mr. Holmes." I said nothing. The man stepped closer, eyes reflecting the lantern light like obsidian. "You altered the moment. That was not part of the cycle." Still, I said nothing. Bell-ringer studied me for a long moment, then tilted his head. "Yet you persist in silence. That, at least, you understand. The performance depends on rhythm." He placed the bell gently on the stone floor. It did not ring. "I had thought to confront you in your domain," he went on, "but I see now that your instincts remain intact. You chose the chapel. You reversed the space." He stepped to the pendulum and looked at it with something close to reverence. "Time is not a line, Mr. Holmes. It is a spiral, every event, a repetition, but not identical. The spiral widens." He turned to me. "And yet you resist. You always resist." He reached into the satchel and removed a second object, a watch identical in appearance to the backward-counting one Holmes carried. He held it up. "This one moves forward," he said. "Tick by tick, a perfect twin. When they meet in time, when backward and forward collide, the moment of change arrives." He placed it beside the first. Now the two lay ticking in opposite rhythms, one winding toward zero, the other away from it. I dared not speak. Bell-ringer stepped closer. I could smell oil on his coat, the faint scent of burned matches. "You know what comes next," he said softly. "The bell tolls. The shift completes. You vanish. I awaken." He reached toward the forward-counting watch to adjust it, and I moved. In one swift motion, I struck the table with my elbow, knocking the watches apart, the pendulum arm rattling as it shifted. Bell-ringer jerked backward, but I was faster. Holmes's cane, hidden beneath the folds of the coat, was in my hand and sweeping upward. It caught him square in the shoulder and sent him stumbling against the stone wall. The bell clattered to the floor and rang once. A soft silver chime. Bell-ringer hissed in pain and turned, but by then Holmes was there. He emerged from the shadows like a revenant, moving fast and silent. In an instant, his hand was at Bell-ringer's throat, the other gripping the man's wrist with iron force. Bell-ringer struggled, but not for long. Holmes twisted once, and the satchel fell from his hand. "Enough," Holmes said, voice low and clear. Bell-ringer froze. "I've let you play long enough," Holmes continued. "The performance is over. The curtain falls now." The man sagged in his grip, breathing hard. "You changed the scene." "Yes," Holmes said. "Because unlike you, I don't confuse illusion with power. You constructed a puzzle to prove time can be shaped, but you forgot one constant." Holmes looked to me, the observer. Bell-ringer smiled faintly, blood at the corner of his mouth. "You'll never understand it, Holmes. You live inside the frame. I broke it." "You broke a man's mind," Holmes said, "and then his body. And you did it not for philosophy, but spectacle." Holmes stepped back. "Watson." I retrieved the watches. The backward one ticked on. The forward one had cracked in the fall. Its hands stuck now at 11 minutes past 4. Holmes retrieved the bell. "This was the trigger, wasn't it? The cue for the next subject to act. You sent them the note. You instructed them to await the sound." Bell-ringer said nothing. Holmes turned to me. "There's another location, Watson. Someone else was drawn into this play, just as Massey was. We must find them before their bell tolls." "And what of him?" I asked. Holmes looked at Bellringer. "He's done. His illusion is broken. But if we don't act quickly, someone else may yet die on cue." I slipped the watches into my coat as Holmes bound Bellringer's hands. We left the chapel beneath a sky now deepening to night. Behind us, the pendulum had begun to sway, slightly, naturally, as if freed at last from its paralysis. Ahead, the city waited, and somewhere within it, the final act had not yet begun. The streets outside the chapel had turned brittle with frost. The mist that once clung like breath to the Thames was now woven through with the colder breath of night, and as Holmes and I emerged into that pale half-light, I could feel time quickening around us, not as a ticking urgency, but as a tightening of space. Every alleyway, every lamp-lit corner of Southwark seemed to lean inward. Holmes held Bellringer's wrist firmly in one hand, his bound arm secured behind him with a length of twine we had taken from the satchel. The man's coat flared open, with each struggling step revealing a lining of strange symbols inked along the inner seam, glyphs not unlike musical notations, except curved, chaotic, reversed. He had orchestrated this madness to the last detail, but Holmes was no longer playing his part. "We need to move quickly," Holmes said, voice clipped. "He's played a final card. Somewhere in the city, the last note has been struck but not yet heard." I fell into step beside him. "You think another victim is already in place?" "I'm certain of it." Holmes didn't glance at me as he walked. That was the last intent Bellringer gave away. Another vanishes, another awakens. The pattern holds. Someone else is caught in the illusion, prepared to act, or to die, at the sound of that bell. "And the location?" "That," Holmes said, eyes sharp beneath his hat brim, "is why he brought us the watches." We reached a street lamp beneath the crumbling sign of an old tannery. Holmes stopped, set Bellringer against the wall, and drew both watches from his coat. He held them level in his palms. "See," he murmured, "the backward one continues to tick, ever precise." But the forward counting watch, it stopped, not at random. 11 minutes past 4, he turned the cracked face toward the light. "I've seen that time before." It took him only seconds. He pulled from his inner pocket the photograph Bellringer had left, the one of us in the pumping station. I hadn't looked closely before, but now I saw it. In the upper corner, behind the iron struts, a clock tower barely visible through the broken pane. Its hands frozen at the same time. 4:11. "The photograph wasn't just a taunt," Holmes said. "It was a map. He planted his signal there. The moment the picture was taken, the hour was marked." He tapped the corner. "The clock is atop the Southern Rail signal house, just outside Lambeth Yard." "The freight yard?" I asked. "Yes, mostly decommissioned. But the building still has access to the city's rail signaling systems. It's remote, quiet, the perfect place to stage another disappearance." Bellringer stirred, his voice soft, almost smug. "You're too late." Holmes knelt beside him, his voice lower. "That remains to be seen. But you will tell me exactly what you placed there, or I will leave you in the hands of Lestrade with a full diagram of your chemical dispersal system in Clerkenwell." The man's breath caught. He looked away. Holmes turned back to me. "Watson, get a cab. Now." Within minutes, we were bound for Lambeth, the fog peeling away in our wake. Bellringer sat hunched between us, mute now, though I could feel his pulse racing through the twine wrapped around his wrists. Holmes said nothing the entire ride. He stared out into the dark, jaw tight, one foot tapping with mechanical precision, the echo of the watch now ticking in his head, always ticking. When we arrived, the signal house stood, like a forgotten sentinel, framed by crooked rails and the ghosts of boxcars long gone. The yard was empty, save for a stray cat that darted across the gravel and a single freight lantern burning faint near the switch tower. We moved quickly, Holmes gripping Bellringer by the collar as we climbed the stairs to the office floor. The door was open. Inside, it was warm. A small stove had been lit, casting flickering heat across a scene that froze us both in place. At the far end of the room, seated in a chair positioned directly beneath the old wall-mounted clock, was Victor Massey, alive, awake. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, wide and unblinking. A watch sat in his palm, forward-facing this time, ticking smoothly. Holmes approached slowly. "Massey," he said carefully. "Victor, do you know where you are?" The man's lips trembled. "I thought I was home. Then I was dreaming again. I heard the bell." Holmes turned to me, then back to Massey. "Do you remember anything since the chapel?" Massey swallowed. There were voices, numbers, and a man. He said I would understand when I woke. Holmes knelt. "You haven't been harmed?" "I don't think so, but I'm not sure what's real." Holmes reached into Massey's coat pocket and drew out a folded slip of paper, a note written in the same looping hand Bellringer had used. He sees the clock, but he does not see himself. Beneath it, a signature, just the symbol of a reversed pendulum. Holmes stood slowly and looked to Bellringer, still bound in the doorway. "This was never about killing," Holmes said. "Not truly. You used death only to sell the illusion. What you wanted was obedience. A man who believes time is being rewritten will accept almost anything, even himself as a stranger." Bellringer met Holmes's gaze with something like triumph. "He was a stranger," he said, "and I brought him back." Holmes stared at him, then after a beat, turned to me. "We're done here." We brought Massey down carefully, wrapping him in Holmes's own coat as the warmth began to flee from the stove above. Bellringer said nothing as we turned him over to the constable Holmes had summoned earlier by telegraph. Lestrade's man, sent ahead of us by code. By the time we returned to Baker Street, dawn was brushing the sky with its first cold brushstroke of silver. In the sitting room, the fire had long gone out. Holmes stood at the mantel, both watches laid side by side once more on the shelf. The backward one had stopped. It read 000000. "Did we win?" I asked quietly. Holmes shook his head. "This wasn't a contest. This was a warning." "A warning?" "Yes," he said, picking up the cracked forward watch. "Bellringer didn't just tamper with time. He tried to sever the self, to prove that memory, perception, identity can all be pulled apart and rewired. He looked at me, but he failed, because we saw." I nodded slowly. "And what happens now?" Holmes placed both watches back in the pouch and drew the string tight. "Now," he said, "time moves forward, as it always has." And for once, Holmes did not correct the hour on the mantel clock. He simply let it tick. Morning light filtered into Baker Street in fractured rays, diffused by the grime of the city's breath against the windows. It was quiet, eerily so, as though London itself were unsure how to resume its rhythm now that Bellringer had been unmasked and his grotesque performance brought to its close. But even in stillness, time moved. The ordinary kind. The kind one rarely notices until it has already passed. Holmes stood at the fireplace for a long while, unmoving. I made no attempt to disturb him. On the table, the two watches sat side by side again, one cracked and still, the other backward no longer. Holmes had wound it once before placing it down, as if to test whether time would continue its retreat. It hadn't. It simply stopped. I turned from the mantel and quietly poured us both a cup of tea. When I handed his over, Holmes took it without speaking, though his gaze never lifted from the blackened coals. At last, he exhaled. "There was a moment," he said, "when I thought it might work." "You mean his trick?" I asked. "Number I mean his belief." He turned at last, slowly, and looked at me. Bellringer wasn't simply mad. He was devout. He had made a religion out of fracture, a gospel of the loop. He believed that if he staged enough broken time, he could erase causality itself, remove consequence from action, return people to their beginning. He walked slowly back to the table, looking down at the cracked watch. And yet all he ever truly did was confuse frightened men into obeying him. And nearly killed them, I added. Yes, Holmes said, voice soft. That too. There was a knock at the door, not urgent, not cautious. Simply a knock, clean and definite. I opened it to find Inspector Rivington on the step, collar up against the wind, gloves in one hand, a sheaf of papers in the other. I've brought the report, he said, from Lambeth and Clerkenwell both, and something else you'll want to see. We brought him in. Holmes gestured toward the armchair, though he remained standing. Rivington passed the papers to me, then opened his coat and pulled from his inner pocket a small tin box, the kind used to store pocket tobacco. He placed it on the table, opened it, and withdrew a rolled strip of exposed photographic film. This was found in the development basin behind the signal house. Same film stock as the photo you received. Only this roll had not yet been printed. It was set to develop at the exact moment Massey's watch struck the final minute. He unrolled it gently between his fingers, and even in the soft light of the room, we could make out the dim images. Stills of Massey sleeping upright, time-lapsed frames of the same chair in which we'd found him, taken every 25 minutes as though someone were studying the progression of a spell. This, Holmes murmured, was never meant to reach us. Rivington nodded. Number. But you interrupted the final phase. Whatever this was meant to document, it was cut short. Holmes looked at me. Bellringer wasn't just performing, he was recording, every victim, every moment. He believed he was building a case, not for justice, but for some future audience. He tapped the film gently, then said he wanted history to bear witness to the unmaking of time. I felt a chill rise in me, not from the image, but from the thought of how close we'd come to letting it succeed. Rivington leaned back, rubbing his temple. He's been turned over to the psychological examiners. I'm told he spoke for 3 hours without pausing once. Names, dates, places, none of which can be verified. But he did say one thing I thought worth passing on. He glanced at Holmes. He said, "Tell Holmes the hourglass was never meant to empty, only to turn." Holmes didn't move. Then he'll be disappointed. I intend to leave it exactly as it is. Rivington left soon after. Holmes watched him go, then turned back to the hearth. I resumed my seat, though the warmth in the fire had long since faded. "Do you believe," I asked after a long moment, "that Victor Massey will ever fully recover?" Holmes didn't answer at once. He paced slowly toward the window and drew back the curtain with 2 fingers. Outside, the city went on, carriages passing, bells ringing, distant voices calling out against the clatter of hooves. "He has already recovered more than Bellringer ever intended," Holmes said at last. Massey remembered his name. That was the anchor. The illusion could not hold against it. He knew himself, even through the fog. And the others? There were no others, Holmes replied. Not living. Massey was the final candidate. The others were pieces, test fragments, images burned onto wax cylinder memories. Bellringer's madness sharpened with each attempt until it settled on a man he believed could be convinced he had never been. He turned from the window. He chose Massey because of his work. Timekeeping, celestial measurement. A man already trained to think outside the present moment. He thought Massey could be fractured cleanly, but he underestimated the strength of identity. I poured another cup of tea and said, "And what of the watch?" "The one that still ticks." Holmes crossed to the mantel and picked it up, weighing it in his hand. He turned it over once, then again. Then he placed it back in its pouch, drew the string tight, and locked it away in the drawer beside his tobacco. "There it shall remain," he said. "A curiosity, nothing more. I watched him, silent. Something in his manner suggested this case had settled deeper than most, cut closer to that part of him, which even I rarely glimpsed. Not because it had been dangerous, though it had. Not because it had threatened his life or his reputation, but because it had threatened his framework. Bellringer had tried to play Holmes's own game in reverse, had taken the premise of logic and turned it inside out. And in doing so, he had touched the one place Holmes protected most fiercely, the space in which observation becomes truth. We passed the day in relative quiet. I wrote my notes. Holmes took down the morning's orchid temperatures in his logbook, and the mantel clock ticked on, its pendulum now, mercifully, swinging forward. Only once did he pause. At dusk, he stood by the window again and said, almost as if to himself, "He was right about one thing." I looked up. "Bellringer?" "Yes." Holmes's eyes were on the rooftops, shadowed now by the last light. Time does not return, except in dreams, and even then, only if one forgets to wake. Then he turned and reached for his violin, and in the final light of the day, he played, not for performance nor for thought, but to mark the passing of a moment that would not and could not come again. For several days after Bellringer's arrest, Baker Street returned to its habitual rhythm, cases of forgery, minor theft, and the occasional request for consultation from an overburdened yard. Holmes addressed each with his usual clarity and restraint. But something beneath the surface had shifted. His silences had grown longer, and his deductions, though sharp, lacked the relish they usually carried. He worked with his mind, but not his heart, as though still listening for the backward tick of that impossible watch, even in the quiet of routine. It was on the 5th morning, a bitter day laced with sleet, when the final ripple of the affair returned to us. We had just finished breakfast when a small envelope arrived by post. No seal, no signature. The handwriting, tight and deliberate, was not Bellringer's. Holmes turned it over once, twice, then opened it carefully with the tip of his knife. Inside was a single item, a page torn from a printed journal, folded with care. At its head was a title we both recognized, The Internal Chronometer on Perceived Time in Isolated Consciousness, Victor Massey, Royal Guild of Chronometry. Holmes read in silence for some time. Then he passed the page to me without comment. I read. The article, excerpted from a longer piece evidently, detailed Massey's experiments with individuals kept in sensory isolation. The theory proposed that the mind, denied all external references, begins to form its own measure of time, not by heartbeats or breath, but by memory. In other words, identity itself becomes the clock. The passage underlined in pencil was this: if one could interrupt this interior clock, reversing its associations, inverting its flow, then even a rational man might become unmoored from continuity. But whether such a dislocation could be permanent remains, for now, a philosophical curiosity. Holmes's gaze remained on the fireplace. His voice was low. "That is the final clue?" I looked at him. "You believe Massey wrote this to explain what Bellringer tried to do?" "No," Holmes said, "to explain what Massey allowed him to try." I stared at the page again. "You think he consented?" "I think he was curious," Holmes replied, "and that Bellringer exploited that curiosity." He stood and crossed to the window. Massey's expertise was not just in keeping time, it was in understanding the mind's role in perceiving it. His published work had already skirted the edges of psychological manipulation. Bellringer simply provided the theater. I joined him by the window. "But why send this now? If Massey wants to explain, why not do so directly?" "Because he's not explaining," Holmes said. "He's warning." He turned abruptly, fetched his coat, and was halfway to the door before I could rise. "To the guild?" I asked. "No," he said, already at the stairs. "To the clockmaker." We arrived at Grimwell and Blatchley to find the shop dim and closed to the public. A single lamp burned above the rear counter, and the scent of brass polish still lingered in the air. Thomas Edgebury met us at the door, paler than I remembered him, and with a bandage wrapped around his left hand. "I was just about to send for you," he said. "There's been another message. I didn't know where else to take it." He led us into the workshop. On the main bench, beside the newly cleaned watch that had once ticked backward, lay a folded sheet of drawing paper. Across its surface, sketched with near photographic precision, was the image of a bell, not the one from the pumping station, nor the chapel. It was a smaller bell, mounted on a wall bracket, with a fine chain descending from it. Holmes inhaled sharply. "Where did this come from?" "I found it beside the back door this morning," Edgebury said. "No one saw who left it, but the watch was ticking when I opened the shop, just like before." Holmes reached down and picked it up. This time the ticking was normal. Forward. Even. Precise. "This isn't Bellringer's watch," he murmured. "This is Massey's." He turned the sketch toward the light. "He's telling us where to find him." "But he's already safe," I said. "We brought him back. He's recovering." Holmes shook his head. "He was safe, but not anymore. He's gone." I stared at him. "Gone?" "Voluntarily," Holmes said. "He's resumed the experiment, without Bellringer, and now he's drawn the bell for us. A final location, a final test." Edgebury's voice was hesitant. Is that St. Enoch's?" Holmes turned. "Yes, the old belfry in Whitechapel. It hasn't rung in 20 years. I used to walk past it on my way home," Edgebury said. "They boarded it after the fire." Holmes handed him the watch. "Keep this running. If the ticking changes, let me know at once." We were outside again before the hour changed. Holmes's coat flared in the wind as we crossed the city, taking narrow streets and lesser alleys to reach the burned skeleton of St. Enoch's. What remained of the church stood black against the graying sky, its tower half cracked but still upright. Boards covered the lower entrances, nailed hastily years ago and left to rot. Holmes tested one of them. It yielded with a hollow groan. Inside, the church was silent. Pews turned to ash. Walls scorched. The altar was gone, replaced by mold and damp stone. But the bell still hung. We ascended slowly, stair by stair, up the narrow spiral toward the tower. At the top, through the shattered windows, the rooftops of East London lay beneath us like an old map. The bell hung before us, suspended on a rusted yoke, a pull chain looped to the floor. And standing beneath it, calm, pale, and with a journal in his hands, was Victor Massey. He looked at us as if expecting us, not startled, not guilty, only tired. "You came," he said. Holmes stepped forward. "You asked us to." Massey nodded. Then it worked. The message held. Holmes looked at the journal. "You've been recording?" "I have." Massey closed the book. I had to know whether the effect could be replicated without coercion, without Bellringer's madness. "And has it?" Holmes asked softly. Massey didn't answer. He stepped aside and gestured to the chain. "When I pull this," he said, "I stop being Victor Massey. Just for a moment. The sound disrupts the rhythm. The bell rewinds the self." Holmes didn't move. "And if you don't pull it?" "Then I stay broken," Massey said quietly. Half awake, half dreaming. Holmes stepped forward, then let it be still. Massey looked at him, eyes red-rimmed. "I thought you of all people would understand." "I do," Holmes said. "More than you know. But Massey, time is not your enemy. It is your witness. It is the proof that you endured, not the illusion you escaped." Massey's hand trembled on the chain. I held my breath. He let it fall. The bell did not ring. Holmes crossed to him and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Come down with us," he said. "Let it end forward." and Massey did. We left the tower in silence, 3 shadows walking back into the rhythm of London, unchanged, perhaps, but no longer uncertain. In the weeks that followed, the watch remained still in its pouch, and Holmes resumed his cases with new steadiness. But sometimes, when the house was quiet and the mantel clock struck the hour, I saw him glance toward it, as though listening, just for a moment, for a chime that never came. The case concluded, not with the crack of a pistol or the confession of a trembling villain, but with something far quieter. A man stepping back from the edge he had come to believe was inevitable. In the weeks that followed Massey's descent from the bell tower, life resumed its pace, not so much restored as reclaimed. The newspapers carried no mention of bell ringer, save a short, cryptic note buried in a column of oddities. A curious device discovered in a Whitechapel attic has been turned over to the Royal Society. No comment has been made on its function. The rest was silence. Massey returned to the Guild, though not to his former work. His resignation letter, delivered by hand and worded with exacting restraint, noted only that he would devote himself henceforth to the study of human memory, not in time, but through it. He declined interviews, invitations, and applause. I received a letter from him in April, brief, cordial, and enclosed with a watch. It ticked forward. Bell ringer, for his part, vanished from public record entirely. Committed to the care of the Broadmoor Asylum under orders from the Home Office, he faded into medical reports and sealed files. Holmes received no further correspondence from him, but he spoke of him on occasion. He understood the mechanics of manipulation, but not its cost, Holmes said one morning, seated beside the fire, hands steepled in thought. He believed that time was malleable, and that to twist it was a liberation. But time is not a cage, Watson. It is a mirror. You break it only to find yourself in pieces. I glanced at the mantel. The watch remained locked in the drawer. Holmes never took it out again, though he had not destroyed it either. I asked him once why. Because, he said, truth, even when distorted, remains truth. And it is the business of a detective to remember. Spring came at last to Baker Street, the grey giving way to green in slow but steady steps. We received a handful of minor commissions, none requiring disguises, midnight trains, or elaborate traps. The kind of work that might bore a lesser man, but for Holmes it was a return to discipline, routine, certainty, the things bell ringer had attempted to erase. One afternoon, as we sat together in the golden hush of a rare quiet day, I turned to Holmes. "You never told me," I said, "what finally convinced you that Massey could come back, that he wasn't lost." Holmes didn't look up from his newspaper. "Because he left a clue," he said. I frowned. "The bell drawing?" "No," Holmes replied, folding the paper neatly and setting it aside. "The article he sent us. The journal excerpt, but that was theory, speculation." "It was a citation, Watson." He rose and crossed to the shelves, drawing down a thin, leather-bound volume and flipping quickly through its pages. He handed it to me, open to a familiar paragraph. The same line, "If one could interrupt this interior clock," was there, but now I saw what I had missed before. The footnote. Massey, V. The Mind's Hourglass. Proceedings of the Chronometry Guild, 1891. Written post-recovery. I looked up. Holmes watched me with that rare flicker of approval he gave only when a point had landed cleanly. "He wrote it after," I said. "Indeed," Holmes said, which meant that when he sent it to us, he was not warning that he might fall again. He was proving he had already returned. He sat again, quiet for a long moment. Bellringer staged a drama meant to disrupt reality, to turn time into a stage cue. But Massey left us something more powerful. Evidence. And evidence, my dear Watson, is the one fixed point in an unfixed world. I nodded slowly, letting the words settle. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. Outside, London moved forward, and Sherlock Holmes, who had faced illusion, inversion, and the near unmaking of certainty, returned to his violin and played. Not to challenge time, not to control it, but simply to mark its passing, 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 to mark its passing,